I'm Frank Vaughn, and this is going to be the final edition of our examination into Mark Carney's book. But before we get into that, we have been given a visceral example out of Vancouver of the failure of the Liberal NDP soft on crime policies. And make no mistake, this rests with them. I ask on X, how is a truck plowing through a crowd, killing 9 people, not some form of terrorism? Also, he may have been known to police, but because of Liberal NDP crime policy, such as C-75, there is nothing the police can do. Judges release high-risk offenders onto the streets every day because this guy who was driving this truck was known to police. And I disagree with the framing in the media because the police are not the ones responsible for the fact that criminals are getting put back on the streets as soon as they arrest them. The police can be doing an upstanding job, but if judges don't keep violent offenders in prisons because of legislation that the Liberal and NDP coalition brought to Canada, it's not on the police. So I have great issue with this framing. Also, police are confident it's not an act of terrorism. How is plowing a truck through a crowd of an identifiable minority group killing 9 people not some form of terrorism? What is the motivation that could be inferred from the driver that makes mass murder not some kind of terrorist act? I mean, people were terrified. I'm assuming the crowd wasn't jumping in front of the vehicle. I'm assuming they were fleeing for their lives. Why are they pouring cold water on this? And I think we know the answer. It's politics. Yet again, like we highlighted in yesterday's video, how the RCMP is trying to bring attention to corruption within the Liberal Party, not the RCMP itself, but RCMP members, or how Toronto Police Services are trying to out the government for their soft on crime policy, which is hamstringing policing efforts. Their hands are tied because of the state, because of the courts. This is all going on, but brass and senior management always want to pour cold water on it and cover it up to protect the Liberal Party. And this is the future of Canada if we elect Mark Carney. But make no mistake, even after all of these years of Liberal government failure, soft on crime agendas that have filled your streets with addiction and violence, Cult Montreal, and many other media organizations across this country want you to know that Pierre Poilievre is named the #1 spreader of disinformation in Canada, not by humans, but by ChatGPT, known for the fact that it is a biased form of artificial intelligence, that it is not truly free. But they also remind you that even Elon Musk's Grok has named Poilievre as the Canadian politician spreading the most disinformation on X. But they don't tell you how Grok arrives at its conclusions. It largely examines X posts and gains sentiment. And if you don't ask questions in the proper way, if you don't provide guidance to Grok, you can make it spit out any answer you want. It'll spit out the typical answer, and if you don't push back on it, if you don't encourage it to find more information, it'll just stick to that answer. It's a tool. It's not a replacement for human rationality. It's a tool to enhance your research abilities. You use it much like you would use Google. But here we have, in order to create this headline about Poilievre being a liar, they rely on AI to do it. Beware, Canada is having its first disinformation election. The only disinformation in this election is about Mark Carney. There's a decided lack of curiosity about who this man is. He has managed, through the structure of his run for the Liberal leadership, as well as the short window of elections, he has avoided the necessary financial disclosures that he would otherwise be required to give us. The media lacks curiosity. They don't ask him about his holdings and his investments. They don't ask him about his past. They don't ask him where he's been living. They don't ask him where the rest of his family is. They don't ask him anything because they're in the bag. They're in the tank for the Liberal Party of Canada. They know where their bread is buttered. The Liberals have set off, with the NDP's help, buying and funding the media, and the media is doing their bidding. Now, you don't need complete culpability and conscious action on behalf of the media. It can be subconscious. If you know that one party is going to affect your paycheck negatively and another party is going to promote your paycheck favorably, well, that's a subtle form of favoritism that you're going to engage in. It's very hard for people to act against their own interests. But I find it incredible. And the reason this book review is of some importance is because the book is all we've got. And I often reference Mein Kampf and Hitler. If people before 1933 had read his book en masse, which they didn't do until after he was made chancellor, they would have understood what they were getting. And because the media has no curiosity about Mark Carney, because they're not interested in telling you the full story about Mark Carney, all we have is the book he wrote. And it's a thoroughgoing affair. This man is here to end prosperity in Canada. One of the problems I have with this book is there's so much material in it that I could cover. This could easily be a 6-part series. So what do you leave in? What do you leave out? And something I find incredibly insightful in the light of the fact that we've had this overwhelming lack of curiosity on the part of the media, not a single journalist has ever read a quote from this book and asked a follow-up question. Since we're about to give this man unrestricted power over this country, he already has it. The Liberals and the NDP have created this new precedent of just using orders in council even when government's not in session to continue to govern. Mark Carney will inherit that new power which he helped bring to Canada, because during this election the Governor General has been able to issue $40-odd billion in spending. You don't even have a sitting government. You have a media that's fawning over this man and not asking critical questions, and people dare tell me that Canada is a free country. It's already captured. In a large part, it's already gone, and it's authoritarian, it's top-down. This is in addition to the fact that you have a king and a governor general, and those are your heads of state, not your prime minister, who you don't elect. Your prime minister is appointed. I digress. Self-congratulatory words from the book. The UK has introduced a system of regulatory references to address the issue of people with conduct and compliance violations who move firms without disclosure. Financial firms are now required to share information on breaches of individual conduct rules, their fitness and proprietary assessments, and outcomes around subsequent disciplinary hearings. This means that the histories of such rolling bad apples will be known to anyone hiring them, who can then make their own judgments. So there's not any consequences for the individual. There's not any discouragement, concrete discouragement for a company hiring them. What the company is essentially going to know is how effective a bad actor this potential employee is. So it's almost like an addition to their resume, because companies are looking for people who will make them maximum amounts of profit. This didn't change anything, but this is the big, because he holds up central banking and he holds up regulators as the solution to the very problems that they create. And these are the powerful changes. As he says here, the G20 reforms have created a stronger, simpler, and fairer financial system. It has proven resilient through the COVID crisis. Has it? Because the next time won't be different, authorities and market participants must try to anticipate new risks from cyber to crypto. Let's do this first with the resilience through the COVID crisis. We have rising interest rates. We have a weakening U.S. dollar. We have lingering inflation problems. People will say inflation solved. Yet, unless we had a deflationary environment, all of the increases in prices are baked in. And the absurd increases in grocery costs that have transpired over the last 6 months in Canada, not just over the preceding years, but in the last 6 months, people are really noticing it. They're sharing pictures on social media. Eggs, almost $1 a piece in Toronto. What's happening out there? Does it look like the financial system has solved its problem? Do you feel like you can afford to have wages kept up with inflation? Has the housing bubble really and truly broken? Can you afford to live? These are all things that have happened since he penned these words. And yet here he is, proud of it, proud of the regulators, and identifying the future threats, which he highlights as cyber to crypto. He really doesn't like crypto. And what is crypto? It's a speculative instrument. People buy ticker symbols and they trade them back and forth. But it's also a way for you to transfer value from one party to another party bypassing the entire central banking system. And yes, you have to convert to fiat on the other side. But somebody who bought cryptocurrency with American dollars can transfer that cryptocurrency across borders to, say, somebody in Philippines, and they can then sell it for Philippine currency without having to interact with the banking system except to cash it out. That's an existential threat to the central banks, and they do not like competition. Look what happened to Gaddafi. If you think Gaddafi was taken out because he was some kind of threat to the West, the man had given up his chemical weapons. He was being embraced by Europe as a leader of as a leader of Africa. He was given the tour and the red carpet treatment, and then he wanted to have an independent currency, free of a central bank, free of the central banking network. And he's dead now. And Libya has open-air slave markets. And your leaders of the Western democracy, with all of their so-called concern for human rights that they virtue signal all the time over places like Ukraine, they've had nothing to say about Libya since they unleashed the chaos. And there's another advantage that comes into the equation, which is Turkey moving into Africa and gaining more and more influence. The bad seed in NATO, which is now at risk of direct confrontation with Israel in Syria, but that's a story for another day. We're here to focus on Carney. Back to the book. At the end of February 2020, I sat in a gilded chair in the ornate El Yamama Palace in Riyadh at what would be my last meeting of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors. Again, this is a man who flies in the circles of the richest, most oligarchical people in the world, serving their interest, hiding their money in tax havens, investing their money and making returns. He is their man, not the man of the people. Everyone around the table was familiar with the coronavirus, which was then thought to be confined to parts of Asia, thought to be confined by the experts, thought to be confined by government, who were doing films out front of Chinese all-you-can-eat restaurants and saying it's racist to not eat there and it's racist to stop planes. And Doug Ford, Justin Trudeau, many of your officials, they all said halting plane traffic from China would be too much of an infringement on their human rights. People who didn't have human rights in Canada. You can't violate someone's charter rights if they're not a citizen of the country. But that's what they said before they tried to mandate a medical experiment, before they locked you out of work, before they shut down the economy, before they separated you from their family, before they divided you against each other permanently. Those divisions still last to this day. Before they stomped all over people's charter rights in Ottawa, and whether you like the Freedom Convoy or not, it's a fact. It's been established by the courts. The government had no right to do what they did there, and they faced no consequences. But back then, they thought it was confined to Asia. A respiratory infection, whether it was deadly or not, it wasn't very deadly. It hurt people with comorbidities. The large lion's share of the population was under no threat from COVID-19, as it turned out. But at that time, they said it wasn't a big deal. Some even could name its strain, COVID-19, but few were prepared for what would be required in just a few weeks in their countries. And no one imagined how the professional and personal lives of everyone they knew, everyone on the planet, would be transformed. The ministers from Singapore and South Korea described the measures their country were taking to control the virus, including testing, track and trace regimes that would soon become the envy of other governments around the table. You can almost see the salivation at the power to track every human being as the result of the introduction of a novel cold. It really is worth remembering when this story was coming out of China, that your government officials were telling you that masks were dangerous, that lockdowns were unnecessary, that vaccine passports were draconian measures that shouldn't be done, and that controlling flights over a cold was too much of a violation of charter rights. Shortly after all these things happened, the lab leak origins of COVID-19, the China virus, as Donald Trump has called it, if you mentioned this, you got banned from social media. You were not allowed to say these things. For a time, we weren't even allowed to share scientific papers This was one of the most heavily censored subjects, and it was all corralling the people into taking part in the medical experiment, which the vast majority of people in the Western world did participate in, and did so. Many were coerced, but many wanted it. They trusted the state, and time would prove that they were wrong to do so. Back to the book. We created new liquidity facilities just in case financial markets seized up, and modeled potential monetary stimulus packages that might be needed. Within 10 days, all those plans would be activated, and work would begin on new facilities to provide even greater support. With calm determination and remarkable speed, Andrew and his colleagues would forcefully deploy these measures in the weeks that followed. Mark Carney was at the center of the architecture of all of the programs that printed money and caused the inflation crisis over what was a bad cold. And you weren't allowed to say that at the time. But it did prove to be that way. At the beginning, everybody feared it was going to be something brutal. The cover-up by the state, nobody wanted to talk about China. China was locking down hundreds of millions of people. And our governments were saying it was nothing. You don't lock down hundreds of millions of people without purpose. And I remember very distinctly fearing that it was going to be a deadly pathogen and what it might cause. But I knew one thing certainly was that once the state started to exert control over your life, things would go bad. I couldn't imagine how bad it would get. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. I remember Doug Ford coming out and saying, if we got to go door to door to get needles in arms, that's what we'll do. And that was one of the very key things that made me make up my mind that I had to expedite my exit out of Ontario in case this happened again. I do recall that I had a distinct feeling in January of 2022 that we were nearing the end. And there were people in my life who were panicked. They're just like, I don't know how much more of this I can take. And I said, it's going to disappear faster than you can think. And here we are. And there are some broken minds out there in 2025 that still insist that COVID-19 is a threat, and it's out there, as if they can't see society functioning perfectly normally around them. Broken people. And there's all those who can't admit that they were had. But it's interesting. Back to the book. Once the scale of the threat was finally appreciated, the immediate action was the lockdown of the whole population. This was an extreme example of the state fulfilling its duty to protect by using its coercive powers. Mark Carney's words. Not my words, his words. This was entirely justified in his mind. The lockdown of the entire population over what was by then proving to be a relatively mild cold for the vast majority of people who contracted it. The entire world was shut down. And again, just to read it again, an extreme example of the state fulfilling its duty to protect by using its coercive powers. Its monopoly on violence is another way to call it. Your life would be destroyed if you had have disobeyed them. Many people's lives were. Suppliers and customers. Meeting these twin economic and health challenges has required solidarity at all levels, within our families, within our neighbors and communities, between companies and their employees, suppliers and customers, and between banks and their clients. This wrecked families. This wrecked societies. This destroyed communities. But he's going to tell you in the following pages that it was actually a net benefit. The effectiveness of actions would have been further reinforced by solidarity and cooperation between countries, but this has been virtually absent. The nation-state has been ascendant. Opportunities to share burdens and pool risks have largely been foregone. So this is like him ascribing to the market fault for the crisis, the 2008 financial crisis. It wasn't the banks and the financial institutions and the central banks that turned a blind eye. It was the market itself. Somehow, in his mind, he believes that there wasn't a high level of solidarity and cooperation between nations. The entire world was moving in lockstep. With lockdowns, with masking, with the medical experiment when it came along. And somehow in his mind, the nation state was ascendant, and he's identifying the nation state as the core obstacle to solidarity and cooperation here. You can see his view. Markets are bad, nation states are bad, Coercive, massive government power and its usage are fulfillment of the duty to protect, and there needs to be more global coordination, not less. And the nation state is in opposition to that objective. Quoting, as we shall see, some familiar values are at the core of how to respond to the COVID crisis. Solidarity across all strata of society, from families to companies and banks. Solidarity that, if it isn't voluntary, will be enforced by the coercive power of the state. Quoting again, responsibility of all of us for each other, and of companies for their employees, their suppliers, and their clients. Sustainability, because COVID is an intergenerational crisis, with the health consequences skewed towards the old and the economic consequences skewed towards the young. Fairness in access to healthcare and in bearing the economic costs, and fairness internationally in terms of sharing the burden with emerging and developing economies. And dynamism. After the most acute phase of this crisis passed, sustained efforts are now needed to restore dynamism to our economies, given the enormous expansion of the state and increased fragility of the private sector. So the answer to the fragility of the private sector caused by state intervention is more state intervention. We have to have fairness, which is more international coordination between the nation states, the death of the nation state, the rise of a new globalism. COVID as an intergenerational crisis, because the young pay all the costs, which you are. You might have seen the viral meme of the Brantford boomer giving the double-fingered salute to the young. CBC has seen sufficient to write a piece, not even labeled as opinion, more or less being apologistic towards this man who didn't intend, look at that picture, didn't intend to mock anybody, didn't intend for it to be harmful or to appear callous. There's something with the water in Brantford, but that's a story for another day. This is the face of the government, screwing the young. Mark Carney, we go back to his book, rightly identifies that this was a crisis that largely faced the elderly and those with comorbidities. But it was the young, it was everybody, locked out of schools. Even though the public sector never missed a paycheck, they got all their money. Everybody else got locked out of work, got locked out of their lives, got prevented from seeing their families. People died alone in the dark. Meanwhile, the threat wasn't to the children, wasn't to the young. It's primarily to people who were already sick. We disrupted the whole of society over this. And Mark Carney's proud of it. He sees it as appropriate. The government response is to be celebrated. He sees it as a unifying moment in time where families came together. But that's not how it worked. Every family was divided against itself. And the consequences last to this day. Back to the book, what does this crisis reveal about how we treat the most vulnerable among us? It reveals that we locked the most vulnerable away, and we left them to die alone in the dark. Our elderly, our matriarchs and our patriarchs, in heartless conditions that were supported universally by every single politician in one way or another. The duty of the state. The most fundamental duty of the state is to protect its citizens. Hobbes' conception of the relationship between citizens and the state sprang from his dark view of humanity. Without government, life would be nasty, brutish, in short. The state exercises its authority through coercive power and its monopoly on violence. We have already seen in this book how Mark Carney thinks that all of that is appropriate. He's a big fan of state and central bank power over the people. It's appropriate. It's necessary. COVID is to be celebrated. The government's response to the financial crisis, the regulators' response to the financial crisis, all of these things were public goods, folks. Bailing out all those executives who screwed people out of their homes and out of their life savings, that was public good. $15 trillion in money printing in the financial crisis alone, destroying the value of your savings and triggering an inflationary surge, was a public good. All the money printing during COVID, which created many of the problems that we're having today, were public goods. This is how he sees the world. Locke, this is just a passing thing, Locke included the protection of property rights. Mark Carney in this book talks about property rights. But nowhere does he mention that in Canada, you don't have any. I mean, you literally don't have property rights. Any possession that you have is privileged at the behest of the state. And the state can just sign an order and take anything you have, and they don't even have to compensate you for it. It's been settled. The CCFR, taking all the way to the Court of Appeal, the judges yet again ruled that your private property is not your private property. It is subject not to the whims of Parliament. Not even an act of Parliament is required. Only an order in council, signed by the Prime Minister or signed by the Governor General, is required. Even if your Parliament's not in session, they can continue to ban things and seize your personal property. And more than that, some of that power has been delegated to the bureaucracy. The RCMP has been gifted with the power to arbitrarily ban certain firearms whenever they see fit. So it's not just that the not duly elected but appointed government, an appointed Governor General can do it to you. Now senior bureaucrats can do it to you. Power is moving away from Parliament. What little we have with our vote, what little representation we're entitled to, can't be left alone by these people. They're coming for it too. Quoting, "To both Locke and Rousseau, the duties of the state are products of an exchange whereby citizens accept limitations on their freedoms and obligations in return for benevolent government that works to fulfill its agreed-upon responsibilities." Benevolent government. First of all, when did you ever have a vote to submit yourself to the state? It's never happened. The state is always imposed from on high, even in the best societies. It's just the way it is. Humans will always organize under hierarchies, and there's going to be people who don't have a say in it. But this idea of benevolent government, was the government benevolent when Justin Trudeau went on a French language show and asked if the unvaccinated should continue to be tolerated by society? When we ran articles front page of our newspapers expressing the will to violence against the unvaccinated as though they were responsible for the entire crisis, the COVID crisis? Never once. Because I faced this in my life too. People said because I didn't choose to take the medical experiment that I was putting everybody else at risk, and it was me that was to blame for the lockdowns. These same people, one in particular is a really smart guy. He's in finance. He makes people a lot of money. And this was his attitude. But never did he question the fact that if the government was so worried about COVID-19, why didn't they halt plane traffic from China? The Americans did it first, under Trump. And the media was a full court press about how bad and evil Donald Trump was for stopping that plane traffic. People have forgotten that part of the story. And that would have been the appropriate response. So you could stop it from getting here in the first place. So they blamed the unvaccinated, but they never dared question the state's response allowing it to spread in our countries in the first place. It's incredible. Back to the book. We will at times be asked to run certain risks on behalf of the source of our security, such as being conscripted into an army or risking financial hardship during an imposed lockdown. And that's interesting too. Comparing conscription to the forced lockdown and basically qualifying through talking about Locke and Rousseau, but qualifying those things, saying that those things are an appropriate, not request, imposition by the state under those circumstances. People cannot choose to cancel their contract, nor do they ever provide express consent to be a party to it. But the concept allows us to reflect on our relationship to the state and to consider what we can expect from government and what government can expect from us. What you can expect from government is rulership. What government can expect from you is compliance, because if you don't comply, they will destroy your lives, as they did during COVID. The capacity of the state is the subtitle. Legal capacity, referring to the state's ability to create regulations, enforce contracts, and protect property rights. Again, in Canada, you don't have property rights. This is a non-factor here. But that point seems lost on Mark Carney. Collective capacity, referring to the state's ability to provide public services, and fiscal capacity, referring to the state's power to tax and spend. These capacities are complementary, and any deficiencies in one will impair the others. So the state's power to impose those things should not be inhibited in any of those departments, because if any of those departments are inhibited, it will affect the function of the other departments. Again, it's an argument for total state power. That's Mark Carney. Is it any wonder he loves Marx so much? Another quote, poor families in some cases were provided with government assistance so they could survive forced quarantines. So the justification for the forced quarantine, which destroyed lives, the exchange, as he would call it, is that the state printed a bunch of new money and doled it out to the public, creating all kinds of knock-on consequences, but we're not going to talk about that. From my memory of reading this book, the inflationary crisis that is coming, that was guaranteed to come, because anybody looking at what was happening in 2021 and 2022 knew that you can't print all that money out of nothing without consequence. Those consequences, which were highly predictable. Mark Carney, the self-professed economist who likes to hide on his education and his resume, didn't talk about the inflationary crisis that was being created from 2021 forward anywhere in his book. Remember when they said inflation was transitory? Do you remember that? Everything these people say is an inversion of the truth. And you almost need to treat their words through a model based on not believing any of them at surface level. You have to be discerning because they're always lying to you. In a self-congratulatory and justifying way, Carney states, the state's arms race against bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens is a story of expanded duties and capacities, rooted in traditional notions of government as the protector. It would be a mistake to pin failure on government as an abstraction. Government is not responsible for the failure. If you hold with the notion that COVID-19 was a deadly pathogen and that this crisis was somehow justified, government allowed the crisis to come to your country by not stopping the spread at the border. But you shouldn't blame the government. You shouldn't blame the government for the inflationary spike. You shouldn't blame the government for tearing apart your family through unregulated power. Do you see how this man thinks? How can anybody in their right mind trust this? And how is it, once again, that no journalist is curious about the contents of this book or asking any relevant questions as to what the implications of these words mean? Countries with populations of several million had only a handful of ventilators, and 10 African countries had none at all. Ventilators, as we found out, were causing far more harm than good. Ventilators weren't even an issue. These modes of thinking became entrenched in our governing systems through public officials who harbor these cognitive biases, and by a general population that rewards politicians for delivering immediate benefits and not for preemptively solving issues. So the linkage and why this is highlighted is, in the previous quote, he said it would be wrong to blame government. And in many previous quotes, he highlights how the government is the giver, the benefactor. Remember how he talked about benevolent government, the benevolent state providing service for that monopoly that they have on coercive power? But here he is decrying the public for rewarding politicians for immediate benefits, the kind of immediate benefits that they provided in the wake of lockdowns, all the wage subsidies, all the things that they created. He sucks and blows at the same time. He'll defend government in one sentence, and then he'll tell a partial truth in another sentence. And it doesn't even faze him, doesn't even stop him, doesn't even give him a moment's pause. He just keeps on going. And in that way, you can identify one of the most dangerous people we've ever considered electing to the office of Prime Minister. This next section of quotes is one of the most revealing from the entire book. Instead, those constructing a cost-benefit model must insert some estimate to represent the value of a life or the decline in its quality. How this monetization of life is estimated speaks volumes about our market society. Again, the demon is the market. How it was deployed during the COVID crisis underscores the potential shift in values. Calculations did not need to value life, but instead needed to value the postponement of death. Listen to this carefully. In particular, the focus was on postponing not a specific death, but a statistical death. Presented with imminent and certain death, most people would value their lives at an exorbitantly higher level and thus could not be relied upon for assessments useful to government. Your value of your life, your value of how you live, is not a useful metric for government, so it doesn't count. The estimate of what you're worth must come from somewhere else because you are not in a position to estimate or quantify the value of living yourself. Now, this next section I'm just going to call gobbledygook, but I'm going to read it anyway so that you understand how dry a statistician, the economist Mark Carney, actually is. How dry the examination of human life. The first class of methods, revealed preference, is based on individual behavior in markets where prices reflect differences in mortality risk. In the hedonic wage approach, VSL is calculated in reference to the wage premium one receives for working in a dangerous job. As a simplified example, if the risk of death is at a high-risk job where 1 in 10,000 and workers receive $300 annually in danger pay, the VSL estimate would be $3 million. In an averting cost approach, a VSL is calculated in reference to expenditures people make, such as buying a helmet, to reduce the probability or severity of a bad outcome. In contrast, state preference methods construct a hypothetical market for a given change in mortality risk and ask respondents directly in surveys for their willingness to pay to reduce that risk. The only thing I'm trying to highlight here is how dry this is. This is a man who converts lives in his mind to spreadsheet formulaic models. Depersonalized, unemotional, bordering on psychopathic. Is this who you want at the head of your country? And don't get me wrong, I think there's room for this in society. I think people having these kinds of discussions are something that any society would do. My question is this the kind of individual you want as head of state? I don't think so. I think you want this person subordinated to somebody who actually has emotions, empathy, who doesn't look at human life as though it's just a statistic. Here's another quote. This range of different methods in the assessment of the value of a human life leads to surprising variance in the value of a statistical life across countries. An OECD survey in 2012 showed that in Canada, estimates range from 3.4 million to 9.9 million, while in the United States the range was 1 million to 10 million. The European Commission, meanwhile, recommended the value of a statistical life should be somewhere at the range of 1 million to 2 million euros, and the United Kingdom's Department of Transport used the disturbingly precise figure of £1,638,390. All of this discussion is about the statistical value of a human life. I just don't believe that this should be in a position of high authority anywhere. It's too dry. Research has found that the general public tends to overestimate the negative impact of many, though not all, health conditions. So here he actually tells you one of the man behind the curtain talking points, which is the public's fears often are blown out of proportion when it comes to any kind of pathogen. Hypochondria is far more common than we might otherwise believe. The government took advantage of this fact, so this is an interesting tidbit of truth. In the case of COVID-19, for instance, the benefits of lockdown measures varied considerably when using these various, as I read above, ways of ascribing statistical value to a life, as the virus is most fatal to those who have few expected years of life remaining, the people we left alone in the dark to die. We shut down the entire society of adults, children, everybody, in the name of protecting those who may have died if they had just contracted a normal flu or cold, because they were at the end of their life cycle, and instead of letting them die surrounded by their families, we left them alone to die. Those constructing a cost-benefit analysis must likewise make a decision on whether to value the nature of dying, and if so, how to do so. A generic VSL assumes that all deaths are equal, but studies routinely find that people fear different types of deaths to varying degrees and are willing to pay to reduce the risk of an unpleasant death, such as dying in a crowded hospital isolated from loved ones in the midst of a pandemic. Do I need to describe? Is it necessary for me to commentate on how anti-human this is? How dry? How analytical? How cold and calculating? And this is a man who is an advocate for total state authority over your lives. The state dictating how you can spend your money, where you can live, where you can go. Claiming that he will use the Emergencies Act, declaring emergencies unending, that he will fight Trump to the end. His own PMO predicting that by 2040 people will be subsistence hunting on land without reference to regulation. This is dark stuff. How are Canadians rallying around this in any percentage? And I think the answer is they're not even aware. This is where that decided lack of curiosity on the part of our media really presents a barrier to public understanding of what it is they're being asked to vote for. The book is out there, but it's such a dry read that the vast majority of people wouldn't get this far. We are at page 200. And there's been enough damning stuff up to this point. But the fact is, the real dirty stuff doesn't happen until later in the book, where he's talking about the present and the future. Another quote, responding to this threat, governments took drastic actions to limit the spread of the disease. Not shutting down flight traffic from China, not doing what they could do. They could have used drastic power to stop the spread of the pathogen before it even got to Canada, and they refused to do so. Instead, they waited. They let it spread, consciously let it spread. And then they did all this stuff. Schools and public spaces were shut down. Businesses were ordered to close. People's mobility was restricted. Travel bans were imposed and borders were shuttered. Quarantines, curfews, and other restrictions were put in place. Executive powers were assumed. The military deployed and elections postponed. Some governments began surveillance operation on their own citizens. Those governments include Canada's government. When a newly elected government can rely on generations of constrained power and benevolent governance, it starts from a position of legitimacy. This virtuous circle of governance is a luxury to be prized and carefully guarded, because the opposite, a vicious circle of governments, is always a possibility and too often the reality. Trust in government is diminished by partisanship, self-interest, scandals, incompetent, and unjust procedures. Can you describe what happened during COVID with any better words than what you've read there? Can you describe the last 10 years under the Liberals and the NDP with any less words? Trust in government's at a record low. He seems oblivious to the fact that government has lost all the trust of the people. Even those who are voting for this party and voting for Mark Carney don't trust the government. Now, there's an inherent contradiction there. It's completely hypocritical to vote for these people at the same time as you don't trust government, but that's a different psychological problem for another day. We got to really limit our focus here to Mark Carney, because this is taking forever as it is. Yet another quote. Government orders were complied with instantaneously and consistently, suggesting a high degree of legitimacy. Has nothing to do with a high degree of legitimacy. It has to do with the overwhelming force of state power. If you did not comply, the police would kick your door in. They'd kick your head in. The judicial system was ready with heavy fines and punishment for anybody that stepped out of line. Compliance was mandatory. It wasn't instantaneous and consistent for any other reason than the fact that it was mandatory. But the speed with which populations complied with government directives and whether compliance was sustained provide evidence of the levels of trust, in spite of every single public opinion poll showing that public trust in the government is at all-time lows. It's terrible. Here he is suggesting that the evidence is high levels of trust. It has nothing to do with the coercive power that he spent the first 200 pages detailing and defending, and how it could screw your life up and destroy everything you have. That's not why you complied. It's because you trust them. Isn't this incredible? The U.S. suffered from intense partisanship and high degrees of discord between levels of government during the initial phases of the pandemic, which diminished trust and fed into lower compliance. President Trump openly contradicted health experts and feuded with state governors. Wearing a mask became a partisan issue, resulting in a more than 20% difference between Democrat and Republican compliance with voluntary recommendations. Brazil, under the leadership of Bolsonaro, faced similar frictions and struggled to contain the virus. In contrast, other federalist countries like Canada exhibited remarkable levels of cooperation between levels of government. Led by different political parties, messaging was unified, and traditional political animosities were largely set aside for the greater good. This performance points to the importance of state legitimacy, competence, and social capital. Canada is a shining example, but those dreaded Americans and that dirty Bolsonaro down in Brazil, they were the ones that got it wrong. Now remember, in the world that we live in today, places like Sweden and places like Florida did things very different during COVID-19. And did you know that both of those places are still on the planet and thriving today? That they survived just fine? That there were all kinds of places all over the world that didn't participate in this madness? And they survived? Mark Carney doesn't seem to know that. No. Canada's large amount of coordination, all governments setting aside their differences to come together to implement authoritarian, draconian power on the citizenry, is a public good in his mind. Mark Carney again. When citizens stay at home after a government institutes a lockdown or wear a mask after a regulation requiring one is issued, these actions can be viewed as part of the Hobbesian bargain, obedience in exchange for protection. But that misses an important part of the picture. For many, this obedience stems from their willingness to comply with the decrees of a legitimate and trusted power. Whitewashing state coercion. It's not so much what he's talking about. It's his mindset and his attitude towards those things, how he can exist in an almost alternate reality where people comply with laws because of volunteerism and not because state power is absolute, and it would have destroyed your life to not obey those laws. Compliance is reinforced when policies align with the values of citizens. Once the crisis struck, the values of society were revealed. Citizens across the globe acted as Rawlsians and communitarians, not libertarians or utilitarianisms, broadly supporting lockdown measures and massive government spending, even if they perceived little risks to themselves personally. When the first lockdown measures were implemented, it was widely thought that COVID-19 posed a significant risk only to elderly populations and those with pre-existing health conditions. Now he suggests here, or he hints at the fact that that supposition was wrong, that it only posed a threat to the elderly population. But earlier in the book, he indicates that that's exactly the case. Once again, sucking and blowing at the same time, arriving at different conclusions because of he's in a different spot in the book. There's a pathology here. This is something you note in people who lack true and genuine empathy, that they can, I was saying this last night when I was on Clyde's live stream, that they can lie fluently, that their body language will ring with their words and the truth of their words, even though they're telling a full-fledged lie. And this is one of the things that you have to train yourselves to spot in people, that they lie fluently as others tell the truth. Those are the really dangerous ones, and 1 to 2% of the population is among that group of people who lack basic feelings and empathy. But this is incredible. The public volunteered. It wasn't because of the imposition of the state and the absolute power of the state, but it was because the public wanted to comply with a trusted government. And here he is saying the virus itself targets older populations. 94% of fatalities are those over the age of 60, and those with pre-existing conditions like obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. So there he is telling the truth. Broken clock is right twice a day. Yet above, he talks about this like it was a crisis to everybody. Isn't it interesting just how he sprinkles contrary points all throughout the book and does so very fluidly? As socioeconomic factors like occupation and income intersect with race and ethnicity, countries around the world experienced wide disparities in C-19 fatality among their domestic populations. In England and Wales, the mortality rates for Black, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi people were nearly double that for Caucasians. In the Brazilian city of Sao Paulo, people of color were 62% more likely to die from C19 than white people. There you go, folks. COVID-19 was racist. Statistics Norway has estimated that school closures cost $173 per child per day in lost future earnings and lost parental productivity. The end result is that the young, who are much less affected by the disease directly, will likely pay a significant part of their economic price of the pandemic, even before taking into consideration the possibility of higher taxes over their lifetimes to fund current emergency response measures. So there's an acknowledgement that the emergency response measures borrowed against the future to pay for the costs of government today. Not the costs incurred by COVID-19, but the costs incurred by the government response to COVID-19, and it's a recognition. But nowhere in this quote that assesses this cost does he talk about the ongoing burden of inflation. That is absent from the conversation, and it became the biggest story in the wake of COVID-19. Transitory, then permanent inflation, which is largely permanent because it's baked in. Whenever they say they've reined it in and got inflation under control, you have to remember that all the price rises don't go away unless you have a deflationary cycle. It's incredible how he can write this stuff. The self-professed economist can completely ignore the biggest elephant in the room. So remember how he said earlier that government wasn't to be blamed for COVID-19. Here's another section. Given the lack of preparations and the slow initial responses to the developing COVID pandemic, by the time most governments acted, they had no choice but to close their economies. So they dilly-dallied, they delayed, they allowed it to spread within their borders, leaving them no choice but to act in a heavy-handed, very coercive way. This was a government mistake, but be sure not to blame the government, as Mark advises. It was paramount to reverse what was becoming an explosive contagion of the disease with dire consequences for mortality and human dignity. While it would have been better to have acted earlier, and it would have been even better to prepare well in advance, the decisions to lock down were literally the only viable options by the time they were finally taken. He acknowledges that the risk was primarily to the elderly. He acknowledges the draconian nature of it. He acknowledges the low fatality for everybody else, and yet here he is once again saying that the lockdowns were an entirely appropriate response and shrugging his shoulder at the government's failure to stop the pandemic before it became a pandemic. Government is benevolent. Government is trusted. You will own nothing, and you'll be happy. And so here we have a lesson for the future. Developing a COVID policy framework for the common good, we can take the lessons from climate change, see the next two chapters. In that case, there is an overarching goal, environmental sustainability, that is set by society's values of intergenerational equity and fairness. So this is where he begins to create the linkage between the government response to COVID as a lesson that has been learned, as an example to follow when confronting climate change. A cost-effective analysis explicitly seeks to achieve society's values. In the wrong hands, cost-benefit analysis can determine them. Here he defames cost-benefit analysis determining them in the wrong hands. But in this book, he defines how in his hands and in the hands of the technocracy, which he actually names himself, the technocracy, they intend to determine society's values and how private money, not just public money, is invested in the pursuit of net zero and taming the lion of climate change, as they call it. In pursuing deconfinement, policymakers must pay particular attention to distribution. The scale and distribution of the direct benefits and costs to consumers and workers from relaxing lockdown measures varies widely in terms of changes in wages, consumption, employment, and infection rates. Authorities need to pursue a risk management approach, optimizing expected outcomes after having first limited the possibilities of extreme negative events in ways that are consistent with the public's priorities. As discussed, there is a useful analogy between the use of RO and the use of temperature targets in climate change as part of a rational assessment of acceptable risks. Now, maybe it's hard to discern in those words because of the way that it's written. But what he is talking about here is the total control of human lives that existed under the COVID-19 regime being applied to the issue of climate change, which I would argue is an even greater sky demon than COVID-19. Climate change is something that will forever happen. It can't be halted. Once they've trained you to be afraid of every single thunderstorm, which have been staples across time, since before we had the internal combustion engine, nature has been hitting humans hard. It will not stop. And because it won't stop, the regulations and the power that they take also will not stop. And he is looking to the government's response to COVID-19 for examples of how to pursue slaying the sky dragon of climate change. Another quote, maximizing the prospects of fair treatment for those who get ill and dignity and death for those who do not survive. Was it dignified to let the elderly die alone for so long? Was it dignified to keep them locked down in their facilities away from their most precious, most valuable asset, which was the, as he talks about all the time, social capital, which was the social capital of their families, their beloved? Was that dignity? The COVID crisis has revealed the importance of the state. Where governments proved competent, the compliance of their citizens with lockdown orders was reinforced. Again, not coercion, volunteerism, because the citizens trusted government. The question is whether the values revealed during the crisis will be lived in normal times, bridging the power taken by the state during COVID-19 into the post-COVID-19 world. The lessons learned through COVID-19 to be applied to the fight against climate change. Attention has turned to the very real opportunities the crisis has already revealed in teleworking, e-health, distance learning, and the acceleration across our economies from moving atoms to shifting bits. So keeping mass at home, keeping mass stationary, and just shifting bits around on the internet, as somehow that's going to create a new world. Until a vaccine has been widely applied, travel restrictions will remain. Even afterwards, local resilience will be prized over global efficiency. Now, isn't that a great inversion? This entire time he's been talking about the nation-state ascendant and how that's a barrier to the close collaboration of governments when it comes to COVID-19, and then here he has the nerve to talk about local resilience. The local resilience that the government banned. You couldn't visit your neighbor without a cop kicking down your door. You couldn't visit your own family. Local resilience was left broken and stomped into the mud. And here he is holding it up as though it's the prize at the end of the COVID crisis. And this is also a good reminder that the vaccine story wasn't even begun. It hadn't been told yet when this book was written. So this is pre-vaccine mandates, which he supported. This is before the real tyranny got kicked off, and he supported every bit of it. And he would probably reflect on the high uptake of the first dose of the vaccine as a victory of trusted government. Not the mandates, not the threat of losing your job and your ability to eat and function in society. To be ostracized and demeaned, have your life threatened in the very press, have the Prime Minister ask if your existence should be tolerated. According to Mark, your trust in government is why you complied. This crisis could help reverse that causality so that public values help shape private value. This is another important concept, public values shaping private value. And you'll see in the net zero chapters, if we keep going with this, we're already long, but he recognizes that private money must be marshaled in the fight against climate change, and the only way to marshal that private money is for government and regulators to dictate how you can spend. This term, divine coincidence, where the government dictates what you can do and then somehow the magic of the market is going to solve the problems the government identify. All the while, the government's going to restrict how the private market can try and pursue the solving of those problems, which I call the sky dragon because you cannot solve them. Climate change, if it's even an issue, is not something we can solve, we adapt to. CO2 isn't driving changing climate. The climate has been changing since the end of the Ice Age. You're in an interglacial warm period. I'm not sure how this deception has taken off and taken root so deeply in our society. And I think one of the biggest aspects is it comes down to the self-hatred of humanity for itself. We view ourselves as not part of the natural environment, but we are. We're the highest form of life on the planet. We shouldn't hate ourselves. Should we try to live in harmony with the environment? Should we try to be more efficient? Should we try to be less wasteful? Absolutely. But you're not pursuing any of those things by targeting carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide and targeting it for destruction will not make your water cleaner, will not make your air cleaner, will not make your food cleaner, will not make your streets cleaner, will not solve the problem of paving over large tracts of the earth and then wondering why when it rains on a city it floods. Has nothing to do with climate change. Has everything to do with all the concrete. The heat island effect. All of these very real things, none of them are addressed through the focus and lone focus on carbon dioxide. Back to the book. If we come together to meet the biggest challenges in medical biology, so too can we come together to meet the challenges of climate physics and the forces driving inequality. That linkage between climate and inequality. We can solve political problems just by tackling climate change. Since the last ice age, the human race has thrived over an 11,000-year era of extraordinarily climate stability, the Holocene. Now the stability is shattering. We have created a new era, the Anthropocene, in which our Earth's climate is driven not by the geological rhythms of nature, but by our impacts on the planet. The premise of this is that the 11,000 years of climate stability that he's talking about was stable. It has not been. It's never been stable. You can read about the medieval warm period. You can read about Roman droughts that undermined the empire almost far more than the politics did. I read a book recently about climate over the course of time and how the rise and falls of empire, it made a really compelling case that the rise and fall of empire all over the world is linked to climate and weather conditions. It hasn't been stable. This is one of the principal myths of the climate cult, is that this time is stable. The ice has been melting for 11,000 years. Sea levels have risen 20 centimeters over the past century, with the rate doubling over the past 2 decades. Yet, you can go on Google Earth and you can see for yourself 40 plus years of coastal imagery. And those coastlines aren't changing. There's 1,000 examples, real world examples, where you can just go to the beach along an ocean and you can see that that beach is in the same spot it was in the 1930s and 1940s when people were photographing it. This idea of sea level rise, it's not working unless some magical force is causing the continental plates to rise at the same level as the sea is rising. It doesn't make any sense. There's no sea level rise crisis. It's just not happening. From the book, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has concluded that our current warming trend has unequivocally been caused by human activity. The IPCC excludes deliberately any science, of which there is plenty, that contradicts that human activity is the primary driver. They don't even consider it. Now, Carney doesn't tell you that. Carney doesn't tell you that the research around cosmic radiation and cloud formation or variations in the sun are not allowed to be presented to the IPCC anymore. Only things that confirm their conclusion. No contrary point of view is allowed to be expressed. That's not scientific. That's creating science fact. Carbon dioxide concentrations have never been so high. Not true. You go back far enough and you can find carbon dioxide concentrations at a much higher rate than we currently have on this planet. Generally, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, which were mammals of a much bigger size, would have required a lot of biomass to maintain their lives, it seems the planet was thriving just fine. To get us on a path to stabilize temperatures at a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, emissions need to fall by a minimum of 8% year on year over the next 2 decades. To put that into context, total CO2 emissions for 2020, which incorporated full-scale COVID-19 shutdowns of our economies, decreased carbon dioxide by 7%. It wasn't enough. The entire economy of the world shut down was not enough to save the planet, according to these people. To be clear, even at this crisis-reduced rate, we are continuing to spend our carbon budget, and we are not on track to meet our temperature goals. There's only one way to meet the targets of this madness, and that is the mass-scale shutdown of the energy economy. Green energy can't replace this. The electric grid cannot be expanded to replace this. We must deindustrialize. The internal combustion engine, as you will see, will need to go. Wholesale changes of our energy systems will be required to achieve net zero. That means converting the bulk of energy use to electricity and converting all electricity to renewables. Other technologies which could have decisive roles include hydrogen, particularly for heavy transportation like trucking, shipping, and air travel, and carbon capture and sequestration. Although they have a ways to go to become economic, they will never be economic. Capturing carbon and burying it in the ground will never be economic. Some sectors are much harder to decarbonize than others. These hard-to-abate sectors, collectively accounting for over a quarter of all global emissions, include aviation, shipping, long-distance haulage, and cement and steel production. Just small considerations. These things aren't that essential to the functioning of the world, are they? Emissions reductions will require efficiencies, new industrial processes, and new technologies. In aviation and shipping, biofuels and the potential for hydrogen-powered engines could significantly reduce emissions. In the construction sector, for example, 3D printers can now produce entire homes in 48 hours, reducing construction waste by a third and emissions by half, and, better yet, eliminating most of the workforce. Can you believe this stuff? There's no specifics here. There's just a bunch of broad statements. His idea is that the government can issue policies with these kinds of broad statements, and the magic of divine coincidence, his words, not mine, in the market will somehow make it happen. Private industry, the magic, will just solve all of government's problems, all of humanity's problems, and we will march lockstep together into utopia. How are we going to accomplish all of this great change? Well, we're going to rely on Bill Gates. Bill Gates' book, How to Solve the Climate Crisis, details the key technologies we need to get to net zero. As he acknowledges, this presents political challenges as well as economic and technological ones. This book outlines ways to do so by aligning financial values with social values. Now, that word social values, that's state values. That's top-down technocratic values. Don't get it mistaken. That's what social values means all throughout this book. And it underscores the importance of conserving the carbon budget as best we can to create the time and space for the critical technological breakthroughs Gates and others are pursuing. So admittedly, in 2021, when this was written, and they've been talking about this problem since the 1980s, in the intervening years, in the intervening decades, the technology that we need to realize this dream has not been developed and still does not adequately exist. And this is a problem they say we have to solve by 2030. We're not going to make it unless, of course, we completely deindustrialize. Having rapidly industrialized, China now generates over a quarter of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, followed by the U.S. and the EU. On a per capita basis, there are considerable differences between nationalities. Australian, U.S., and Canadian citizens emit 3 times the average, while residents of Chad, Niger, and the Central African Republic emit 160 times less than these highest emitters, or just 0.1 ton per capita. So, in order to meet our climate objectives, we just have to look to the socioeconomic conditions and living style of the citizens of nations like Chad, Niger, and the Central African Republic. They're the examples that we have to follow. Maybe that's why we're importing so many people from the third world, not from Europe, but from a completely different universe to Western value systems. We're bringing them in so that they can teach us how to live in an enlightened way. And by following them, we will achieve net zero. It is the global analog to the need to shift greenhouse gas consumption from the voracious boomers to the sustainable millennials. That means the voracious boomers who did all the consumption. Millennials will need to not consume. You'll need to live as the citizens of Chad, Niger, and the Central African Republic. It falls to you, millennials. And it falls to the generations that descend from the millennials to live like sub-Saharan Africans. Chinese emissions look relatively small, even though today China emits the most carbon into the atmosphere. You will find Chinese apologism also throughout this book. Had we started in 2000, we could have hit the 1.5 degrees Celsius objective by having emissions every 30 years. Now, we must have emissions every 10 years. If we wait another 4 years, the challenge will be to have emissions every year. If we wait another 8 years, our 1.5 degrees Celsius carbon budget will be exhausted. Even if no one buys another car with an internal combustion engine, installs a new gas-fired hot water heater, or at a larger scale, constructs a new coal power plant, we're still stuck not meeting targets. Going forward, we will need almost all new machines, like cars, to be zero carbon and to scrap any new ones that are not before the end of their useful lives. Are you driving a gas car? Are you driving a gas truck? Before the end of that vehicle's useful life, it is Carney's plan to scrap it and remove it from the world. And now for more fear. One of these scenarios, Hot House Earth, models what might happen if there is limited action on climate change and emissions grow and temperatures rise above 3 degrees Celsius. There's no guarantees in a warming world, which, by the way, a warm world is a good world because humans don't do well in the cold. We adapt better to the heat. And there's no guarantee that in a warming world, cloud formation will be stable, that some regions versus other regions won't get net cooler, that won't achieve some kind of positive net balance, that there might be some kind of feedback that lowers or raises, rather, the formation of clouds. Like, there's a lot of assumptions that a rise in temperatures, whether driven by man or not, is going to be net negative. And the fact is, if we go through history, human history, the cold periods kill off humans. The medieval ice age, the cold spells that we've experienced over the course of time, there's too many to number, are bad for human life. The warm periods enabled the rise of Rome, have enabled empire, have enabled civilization. So this notion that warmth is the enemy is actually an inversion of observed scientific reality. Thus far, the combination of sophisticated forecasting, a forward-looking capital regime, and business models built around short-term coverage has left insurers relatively well-placed to manage physical risks. Insurers must update their models constantly and adjust coverage prudently. In time, growing swaths of our economy could become uninsurable absent public backstops. $250 billion to $500 billion worth of U.S. coastal property could be below sea level by 2100. So in order to continue to insure those coastal properties, which pension plans invest in, the Canada Pension Plan owns multiple coastal properties all around the world without concern for this. What he's talking about when he says public backstops is that the taxpayer, you, are going to have to start underwriting insurance companies to insure those properties on the coast, public backstops, from that flooding that we can't observe. Like, we literally cannot observe the sea level rise that they're telling us is happening. You can't observe it at all at the surface. We have comparative photographs from all over the world, dating back decades. And those beaches and those coastlines are exactly where they were while they're telling you that sea levels are rising. The combined market capitalization of the top 4 U.S. coal producers has fallen by over 99% since the end of 2010, with multiple bankruptcies. To meet the 1.5 Celsius target, more than 80% of current fossil fuel reserves, including 3/4 of coal, half of gas, and 1/3 of oil, would need to stay in the ground, stranding these assets. When I mentioned the prospect of stranded assets in a speech in 2015, it was met with howls of outrage from the industry. That was in part because many had refused to perform the basic reconciliation between the objective society had agreed in Paris the carbon budgets necessary to achieve them and the consequences this had for fossil fuel extraction. Society didn't agree. The technocrats agreed to Paris. The governments, which all too often are not accountable to the people, agreed. The industry howled because it's the end of the industry. It's the end of prosperity, particularly for the western provinces. This is the path, this is the course that Mark Carney is committed to. And why? He's going to hold up his ideal moral philosopher. They couldn't or wouldn't undertake the basic calculations that a teenager, Greta Thunberg, would easily master and powerfully project. Now recognition is growing, even in the oil and gas industry, that some fossil fuel assets will be stranded. Not some, all. Remember, you have to live like the citizens of Chad, Niger, and the Central African Republic if we're going to save ourselves. It's all in this book, folks. I don't know. I think these videos, they go on for long. I think necessarily they go on for long. Maybe I could be more efficient. But there's too much material here. He spells out his plan. And there's a fundamental lack of curiosity about this book. Many carbon-intensive, long-duration assets are vulnerable to stranding, including power stations that generate electricity from fossil fuels, heavy industrial assets such as steel mills or petrochemical plants, and pipelines. Factors that reduce vulnerability include low initial cost, short duration, and adaptability. For example, some North Sea infrastructure is moving from oil to wind. Some gas pipelines may one day carry hydrogen. This is pipe dream stuff. He's talking about technologies that don't exist today that must be created and implemented at scale over the next 4 to 8 years, by his own words. None of this is going to happen. It's just like I said when I was doing the debates years ago, that everybody signed the Kyoto protocols, nobody met them. It's the same with the Paris Climate Treaty. The only way to meet the Paris Climate Treaty is to essentially explode society. You have to end civilization. It's the only way Paris works, because the alternatives don't exist. So, if you hate civilization, then you should subscribe to the whole sustainability agenda, because it seeks to end civilization. And again, send you back to sub-Saharan Africa. And not send you back literally, send you back there in terms of living standard, because the entire world must become the third world. Actually, beyond the third world, you have to go back to subsistence living in order to meet these targets. That's reality. It's the reality spelled out in this book. The estimates of the economic impact are significant, with most suggesting the equivalent of more than a decade of lost global growth to deal with this problem. A dynamic unprecedented in the modern era. These calculations are highly likely to be underestimated because of the exclusion of climate feedback loops and a host of economic channels. Again, climate feedback loops are assumed to be net negative. It's an assumption. It's not scientifically proven in any way. No account is taken of non-market values, such as the value of species lost in the sixth mass extinction. With what urgency should we act? This has been my problem for many a year. The fixation on CO2, the fixation on climate change, this notion that CO2 is driving everything, isn't going to help save the species. It's not going to help save the forests. It's not going to help with any of those ongoing problems. It's not going to make your water clean. But this linkage is repeated ad nauseum in these circles, that if we just target CO2, we can create a better world for all, and that we can save all the animals. It's a false linkage. And there's no mention in the book of the fact that if you deindustrialize, if you stop mechanized agriculture, if you do all the things that will be required to decarbonize the economy, that billions of people worldwide will be forced into subsistence living, which means raiding the forests, raiding the biodiversity, killing off all of those precious animals that you're talking about so that they can eat and sustain themselves for another few days until it's all gone and they turn on each other. There's no plan to address this glaring shortcoming in the fixation on climate. The average price of about $15 per ton. In comparison, most estimates of the carbon price consistent with achieving the Paris Agreement fall within the range of $50 to $120 a ton, US dollars, with the IMF midpoint of the range at 75. This is just to highlight that this man is dedicated to carbon pricing. He's dedicated to a carbon tax, and whatever he's been saying on the campaign trail is just dishonest, but that should be no surprise. He engages with dishonesty as easy as the rest of us breathe. But the question might be asked, why does someone have to be paid not to be a jerk? When companies are knowingly on a path inconsistent with net zero, there are echoes of tech companies paying all the tax due while using complex offshore tax shelters to avoid there being any due at all. Complex tax shelters, which Mark Carney has spent his career designing for his clients. Complex tax shelters, which Brookfield takes full advantage of. Do you see this man laid bare before you, describing behaviors as the enemy that he engages in himself? This is exactly what efforts by leading companies, regional governments, and countries are trying to achieve, a political consensus that leads to shared management, and by doing so, unleashes the private sector dynamism. So political consensus first to form the basis of private sector dynamism. The public sector will dictate what the private sector can do, and then the private sector, which we're going to gloss over the fact that the private sector is not so private anymore if the public sector is dictating what it can do, will be left to do its magic within the bounds the public sector dictates. It's incredible. This is incredible stuff. It began in earnest in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. And then he mentions the Kyoto Protocol, agreed at COP1 and adopted at COP3 in 1997. This was the first legally binding agreement on emissions limits, but captured only developed countries. Within a decade, it became clear that Kyoto was flawed because it wasn't realistic. It couldn't realistically be implemented. Legally binding or not, it didn't work. The law flew by the wayside because reality crushed the law, crushed Kyoto, just as it will crush Paris eventually. Because governments have this need to sustain themselves, and if the people are too hungry, if the people are too riotous, then government is under threat. We don't want a worldwide French Revolution, do we? So of course they'll back off. They have to. It's the only way to preserve the stability of society is to realistically assess our energy needs. These technocrats who meet in their gilded halls, as Mark Carney describes them, are often divorced from reality, and reality always comes crashing in. So they congratulate themselves when they sign these high-minded agreements, and then they lament when they fail because they didn't take into account the actual state of the world. From the book, scientists and academics have made a business of warning the world of high-impact events from pandemics to meteor flares to volcanic eruptions. Humanity has made a business of ignoring them. So what happened to the high degree of public trust that allowed the public to follow the government into lockdown and medical tyranny? The very thing that he was celebrating and praising to the high heavens earlier in the book, he here says doesn't exist. Humanity has made it a business of ignoring them. COVID-19 has showed this is an expensive and destructive strategy. So which is it, man? Was the response to COVID-19 good, justified, and successful? Or was it a total and expensive and destructive strategic failure? Like, which is it, Mark? I mean, for real. Who are you talking about blaming here? You celebrated the people cooperating with government mandates as a shining example of their trust and faith in benevolent government. You said that government shouldn't be blamed. So if you can't blame the people and you can't blame the government, who the hell are you talking about? A broad range of evidence suggests that financial markets are assigning only a modest probability to transition to net zero consistent with limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Financial markets are out of step with politicians and technocrats because the market tends to understand what is real and what isn't real. The market is saying we're never going to get to net zero. The market's right. The market is assuming that civilization will preserve itself. And for civilization to preserve itself, civilization must have energy, which means the fixation on decarbonizing must fall by the wayside eventually. I really sincerely wish that politicians in Canada and in many places around the world hadn't decided for the ease of political expediency to pay lip service to this insane notion of net zero, including Daniel Smith and Scott Moe and everybody else in this country who I respect and otherwise admire. They have made some strategic mistakes. What they need to do is abandon this language altogether, because this language and engaging with it gives some level of approval to the entire Paris Plan, which intends to leave all of your resources in the ground, and you, according to the Prime Minister's own office, subsistence hunting without consulting regulation in 15 years. That's the net zero plan. From the book, there are already signs that the capital costs for high carbon energy projects are increasing significantly. This increases the prospect of hydrocarbon assets being stranded, increasing significantly because the public sector is dictating that they must increase significantly, and thus they're stranding those assets. Again, this is public policy creating a condition in the market which is going to lead to energy shortages. And here he is talking about it almost in isolation. But given the narrow window, investment must be accelerated at a war-like pace to fight what John Kerry has termed World War Zero. Second, and again, there's that name dropping of all the globalist characters, all the primary oligarchs. John Kerry is a very rich man. Do you think he thinks twice about boarding a plane and flying all over the world to look after his business and political interests? Hardly. They all do it. And then they reference themselves as experts. Second, we need political technology to force consensus to break the tragedy of the horizon and the commons. This is developing. The Paris Agreement and the Strategic Development Goals set the objectives. So, political technology to force consensus. There's that coercion that the state takes. Investment must be accelerated at a war-like pace. That's the public dictating to the private sector where their money must go. Make no mistake, that's what they're talking about. A top-down technocratic effort to save the world from climate change, dictating everything that you do with your life. The urgency to reorient the financial system to finance the tens of trillions of dollars of investment needed over the next 3 decades for the transition to a sustainable economy. Because the challenge of transitioning our economies to net zero carbon is an enormous opportunity. The transition is capital intensive after a long period when there has been too little investment. Building a sustainable future is job heavy at a time when unemployment is soaring. It is green when our world is brown. It is global when we are being pulled to the local. So he talks about, oh my God, it kills me. He celebrates community, local, decentralization when he's talking about COVID, which he directly compares the response to COVID to the necessary response to climate change. And yet here he's talking about the need for global response over the local. And very much the first sentence, the urgency to reorient the financial system to finance tens of trillions of investment. The government doesn't have the money. Private industry does. So again, political technology to force private investment in the things the government deems necessary. All in pursuit of an objective to send you back to a living standard present today in sub-Saharan Africa. Do I need to even go on? Some estimate that by 2035 it will be possible to meet almost 90% of power demand with a mix of wind and solar. This will require 2 things. First, progress on storage and loading challenges for optimization of power grids given intermittency issues with renewable power. Second, it will require rapid deployment, doubling capacity every 7 years, which, as we shall see in a moment, will depend crucially on the credibility and predictability of public policies. Credibility and predictability of public policy. So public policy must be set, industry must be marshaled, and this is a pipe dream. The idea that solar and wind can power the transport grid, can power homes, can power business, that can maintain civilization, and we can do it all with solar and wind. This is a clear pipe dream. The technology for cars exists, but we need the supporting infrastructure, such as EV charging points and the right incentives, such as scrappage schemes and potentially EV tax breaks. Scrappage schemes means paying you to get rid of your gas-powered cars to help you subsidize the purchase of electric vehicles. This whole building EV charging points. How expensive has this attempt been in the United States under the Biden administration? How many billions of dollars spent for how few built? There's an entire infrastructure. It's not just the energy that's required to power the infrastructure, it's also the sheer amount of copper and construction, the carbon emitted to create an entirely new upgraded electric grid to chase this pipe dream. None of it's realistic. There's a whole damn book written here about pursuing something that can't ever be realistically achieved, and this man is about to take control of Canada if the electorate allows it to happen. A fantasy that will destroy human lives Everyone will suffer under this scheme, a scheme that can never achieve its stated objective. There is so much more in this book, but we've been at this for I don't even know how many hours now. And today I've been at this since 6 this morning, compiling this hour-and-a-half video, and I still haven't covered a fraction of it. But I think at this point you have the point. If you've watched this far, you understand. So let's finish with this. Financial technology to ensure that every financial decision takes climate change into account. Every single purchase, every single investment must be engineered around fighting climate change. This requires a fundamental reordering of the financial system so that all aspects of finance, investments, loans, derivatives, insurance products, whole markets, systemically take the impact of their actions on the race to net zero. The objective is a financial system in which climate change is as much a determinant of value as credit worthiness, interest rates, or technology, where the impact of an activity on climate change is a new vector, a new determinant of value, and it requires the creation of some new markets, dictating where private money can go, dictating what you can and can't do, elevating climate change assessments to the very ability of you to repay a loan, that your loan will be subject to climate change approval. Mark Carney, in his own words, folks, if you value this work, please consider supporting it via the website. And I'll see you tomorrow. I'm going to be going on Clyde, do something for a while. There's a whole bunch of coverage going on. I'm not entirely sure how it's going to work out. I'm going to go live at some point. I'll go live for a bit. Maybe I'll be off and on all day. There won't be a whole heck of a lot of structure to it. We're all just going to be around waiting to see what the future holds. I'm Frank Vaughn. I'll see you in the next one.